Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us here this evening. Hello to all of you out here in the Zoom webinar, and of course, hello to all of you watching on YouTube as well, either now or in the future. We're here tonight to celebrate the 2020 J.W. Dafoe Prize-winning book, The Good Fight, Marcel Cadieux and Canadian Diplomacy, published by UBC Press and written by Dr. Brendan Kelly. Tonight is, as you can imagine, presented by the J.W. Dafoe Foundation. Though we're very sorry to not be able to all gather in person tonight to celebrate, we are delighted that you can all join us online here this evening as we celebrate the book and hear from its author. Naturally, at the end of the evening, after the presentation, there will be the opportunity to ask questions of Dr. Kelly. Please feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A box. You can find that located just at the bottom of your screen right there. You can ask those questions at any point during the presentation. Rest assured you won't interrupt us, and your host will get to them when we do move along to the Q&A portion. But before that, I'd like to introduce your host for this evening. Dr. Christopher Adams is the chair of the J.W. Dafoe Foundation, as well as being the rector of St. Paul's College, chair of the Arthur V. Morrow Institute for Peace and Justice, and an adjunct professor in political studies at the University of Manitoba. He has served in senior positions in the public opinion research industry for 20 years. He writes on polling and politics, is the Canadian representative on the World Association of Public Opinion Research, and is currently writing a book on the history of polling in Canada. Dr. Adams holds 2 degrees from the University of Manitoba, St. Paul's College, and a PhD from Carleton University in Ottawa. Please join me in welcoming your host for this evening, Dr. Christopher Adams.
Thank you, John. I'm very honored to be at this session, and I want to thank McNally Robinson. We were just before this session started up. We were talking about how valuable McNally Robinson is. Brendan Kelly's from Saskatoon, and he knows as well the importance of this bookstore to each of our cities. So hello, my name is Christopher Adams and the chair of the J.W. Dafoe Foundation Board of Directors. I'm very honored to welcome you to this event featuring Dr. Brendan Kelly, who is the author of The Good Fight, Marcel Cadieux and Canadian Diplomacy, which is published by the University of British Columbia Press, otherwise known as UBC Press, and the winner of the 2020 J.W. Dafoe Book Prize. The Dafoe Foundation advances the ideals of John Wesley Dafoe, who was the editor of the Winnipeg Free Press from 1901 to 1944, and the most significant and influential Western Canadian journalist of the 20th century. He was crusty, feisty, and hard-nosed in the advancement of his vision for Canada, a Canada strongly independent and influential in a troubled world. A trust in J.W. Dafoe's name provides support for an annual graduate student fellowship, the annual political studies student conference, an essay prize, and the J.W. Dafoe Book Prize, among other things. The Dafoe Book Prize was inaugurated in 1984 and is given annually, with the prize being $10,000. It is one of the richest book prizes offered for good nonfiction writing about Canada, Canadians, and the nation in international affairs. The Dafoe Book Prize attracts 30 to 50 contenders each year. Among the previous recipients of the prize are Dennis Smith, Jack Granatstein, Christina McCall, and Stephen Clarkson, and Gordon Robertson, and now Brendan Kelly. The new work by Brendan Kelly is an insightful biography of one of Canada's most influential Canadian diplomats, Marcel Cadieux, a young Quebec Francophone lawyer who joined the Canadian Department of External Affairs in 1941. This is more than a biography, in that it provides insights into Quebec's position in the country of Canada, Canada's foreign relations with such countries as France and the USA, and insights about the inner workings for the federal civil service from the 1940s to the 1970s. It is a significant contribution to our historical understandings of Canadian foreign affairs, public administration, and Canadian federalism. Personally, as someone who has studied Canadian politics for many years, I learned a lot by reading this excellent book. Now, a little bit about our featured author and the winner of the 2020 J.W. Dafoe Book Prize. Dr. Brendan Kelly has taught courses in history and international relations at the University of Toronto. He is a continuing fellow at the U of T's Bill Graham Center for Contemporary International History and serves as the book review editor of International Journal. He recently accepted a position with the federal government in Ottawa as head of the historical section and as the Deputy Director of the Foreign Policy Research and Foresight Division at Global Affairs Canada. Dr. Kelly, we are so pleased you can join us this evening. I look forward to having you sign my copy, it's right here, my copy of your book, and that you'll be able to sign books for others at future dates when we can meet in person. And to order your book, that is for those in the audience, to order the books, simply go to mcnallyrobinson.com, their website, and they do curbside pickup for any books you may want to order. But welcome, Dr. Kelly. We're very pleased to have you here to present to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adams, for that. Thank you, Dr. Adams, for that kind introduction. Let me begin by expressing my gratitude to the J.W. Dafoe Foundation for awarding me its book prize this year. Winning it has been a truly humbling experience. The list of past winners includes some of Canada's most eminent historians, political scientists, and journalists. It also features two of my own mentors, Professor Jim Miller, who won the prize in 1997 for his pioneering history of the residential schools in Canada, and Professor John English, who won the award in 1993 and 2007 for his magisterial biographies of Lester B. Pearson and Pierre Trudeau. As someone born and raised in Saskatchewan, it was also gratifying to receive such a prestigious award from an organization based on the prairies. Although I may now live and work out east, my heart will always be in Western Canada. We may quarrel over who has the better football team on Labor Day or during the Banjo Bowl, but we prairie folk don't forget our roots. We also have a different outlook on national life, as John Wesley Dafoe knew better than anyone as editor of the Winnipeg Free Press. I would be remiss if I didn't also mention that my winning the Dafoe Prize will always be associated with another major event in my life, the birth of my first child. She was born on April 16th. Exactly 20 days later, the Dafoe Foundation announced that I had won its book prize for 2020. The news capped off one of the happiest and most memorable periods of my life. Needless to say, the generous sum that accompanied the prize was deeply appreciated by a new family. As a good friend joked, $10,000 buys a lot of diapers. What I would like to do over the next 25 minutes for those in the audience is to give you a sense of the major themes of my biography of Marcel Cadieux, who I would argue is one of the most important but little known diplomats in Canadian history. The book is called The Good Fight because Marcel Cadieux was a fighter. His groundbreaking diplomatic career between 1941 and 1980 was defined by three passionate convictions, and these are the major themes of my book: his anti-communism, his French-Canadian nationalism, and his professionalism. I will briefly consider each one. Now, Cadieux was one of the fiercest Cold Warriors in Canada's Department of External Affairs, or DEA. As a Catholic raised in the traditional Quebec of the 1930s, he opposed communism and everything it stood for. And with the Soviet Union a major ally against Nazi Germany, Cadieux's anti-communism lay dormant during the Second World War, but it resurfaced in 1945. Posted in Belgium, he heard disturbing reports about the Red Army's conduct during its liberation of Eastern Europe and capture of Berlin. As he wrote, a fiery glow seemed to cover Eastern Europe. A sinister new era was on the horizon. He was right. An iron curtain soon descended on Europe, marking the start of the Cold War. In this new conflict, there was no doubt where Canada, the Canadian people, or least of all Marcel Cadieux, would stand. As a professional diplomat, he was shaped by the defining events of the early Cold War, including Igor Gouzenko's revelations of Soviet espionage on the West, the Berlin blockade, the creation of NATO, the Soviet acquisition of the nuclear bomb, the triumph of communism in China, and the Korean War. From his desk in the East Bloc, the DEA's headquarters back then, Cadieux could see that the world had become an unusually dangerous place. Over the next few years, he got firsthand proof of it. In 1950, he spent 2 weeks behind the Iron Curtain. George Orwell's 1984 had just been published, and Cadieux was struck by the parallels between that fictional universe and the all too real world of the Soviet bloc. Upon arrival, he found the atmosphere oppressive and felt watched. People on the street looked tense. Once, in the middle of the night, Cadieux was awakened by the sound of marching soldiers. There was something terrifying about this organized activity, he wrote, this trained force outside in the darkness. His stay behind the Iron Curtain was brief, but it strengthened his conviction that communism had to be stopped. As luck would have it, Cadieux was next posted to NATO headquarters in Paris. The mood there in the early 1950s, unlike perhaps today, was confident and creative. Galvanized by the Soviet threat, member countries were willing to contribute militarily to the organization. Things were moving on all fronts. There was faith in an alliance that embodied the old axiom, strength in unity. For Cadieux and other Western diplomats of his generation, the task of NATO was clear: to keep its powder dry until the day the Soviet Union was no longer a threat. From the Cold War's European epicenter, Cadieux was then posted to its distant periphery, Southeast Asia. Humbled in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, France had decided to withdraw from Indochina. Along with India and Poland, Canada was asked to supervise the ceasefire agreement, dividing Vietnam in two. It was the most traumatic assignment of Cadieux's career. Although Vietnamese civilians were supposed to be free to move either north or south during the first 300 days of the ceasefire, North Vietnam did everything it could to prevent people, especially Catholics, from leaving. The Viet Minh were nationalists, but in Cadieux's view, they were also ruthless communists to whom the very idea of personal freedom was anathema. Vietnam scarred Cadieux. When he arrived in Hanoi, his hair was dark. When he left it 6 months later, his hair had begun to turn white. By 1955, Cadieux had become a cold warrior. He spent the next 15 years in Ottawa, an unusually long time, where he exerted a major influence on Canadian diplomacy. Although his views on the Cold War were conservative, it must be noted that he opposed the hysterical anti-communism of the far right in the United States, as embodied, of course, by people such as Joseph McCarthy. Nor was he averse, Cadieux that is, to talking with communist representatives, since in an age of nuclear weapons, not doing so could have catastrophic implications. Nevertheless, Cadieux had no sympathy for those in the West who approached the Soviet Union with a blind eye and a deaf ear. His greatest worry was always that Canada and its allies would be lulled into a false sense of security. As one contemporary recalled, Cadieux understood what few did, the Soviet mentality. In dealing with the Russians, he knew that you had to stand your ground until they surrendered some of their own. Deeply committed to Western liberal democratic values, Cadieux did not live to see the end of the Cold War, but he would have felt vindicated, I think, by the joy in Eastern Europe that greeted the fall of the Berlin Wall 31 years ago this month. Marcel Cadieux's second great passion was his French-Canadian nationalism. It's hard to grasp today just how unconventional it was in 1941 for a young Québécois to join the federal public service. This was decades before official bilingualism in Ottawa. Cadieux's family couldn't understand why he would want to go there and work for les Anglais, the English. As his father said in one heated argument, having a son in Ottawa is like having a daughter who is a prostitute. As a French Canadian with broken English, Cadieux's early years in the public service were difficult. He escaped to Montreal every weekend, but upon his return to Ottawa on Monday morning, the mere sight of Parliament filled him with dread. He was part of a world he didn't understand and whose language he had not yet mastered. As he later quipped, Ottawa was the hardest of his foreign postings. But Cadieux persevered. He felt that French Canadians should put up or shut up. In his view, they had no right to complain about their place in Confederation if they were unwilling to come to Ottawa and improve it. To boost the tiny number of Francophones in the DEA, he waged a one-man recruitment campaign in Quebec with no fewer than 4 French-language books on Canadian diplomacy. To get them into print, he waived his right to royalties and promised his publisher that he would buy 100 copies of each volume. at market price, no less. In the interest of full disclosure, I did not make the same deal with my own publisher. Cadieux also revolutionized Canadian foreign policy, which in the 1940s and 50s was highly Anglo-centric, insisting that Canadian diplomacy should also reflect the interests of the French part of the country, a sizable 1/3 of its population. Cadieux was the architect of Canada's first foreign aid program for French-speaking Africa and of cultural relations with Francophone Europe. His rise in the public service was celebrated in Quebec, where his promotions made front-page news of newspapers like La Presse and Le Devoir. In 1964, the government of Lester B. Pearson appointed Cadieux Undersecretary of State for External Affairs, or Deputy Minister. It was a wise choice. In the 1960s, Canada faced what the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism called the greatest crisis in its history. In Quebec, the Quiet Revolution was underway, fostering a distinctively Québécois as opposed to French-Canadian nationalism. Some Quebecers called for independence, while the FLQ planted bombs to achieve it. In this tense atmosphere, the provincial government of Quebec demanded new powers from Ottawa, including the right to act abroad and even to sign treaties in areas of its domestic jurisdiction. This being contrary to both constitutional and international law, it threatened Canada's very existence as a sovereign nation. Cadieux was stunned. Almost overnight, he went from being one of Quebec's leading champions in Ottawa to its harshest critic. He was called all sorts of things in Quebec, a handmaiden to the English establishment, a self-loathing French Canadian, and a vendu, that is, a traitor to his race. But Cadieux didn't back down. The threat to his country was simply too great. What made that threat so serious was that Quebec had a foreign ally. Under President Charles de Gaulle, France extended a kind of de facto international recognition to Quebec. It received its visiting premier like a head of state, snubbed the Canadian ambassador in Paris in favor of the Quebec representative there, and signed education and cultural agreements with the province. Yet few in Ottawa were worried. It seemed unthinkable that one of Canada's so-called mother countries, a nation Canadians had fought in 2 world wars to defend or liberate, and a key NATO ally, would intervene in our internal affairs. On the evening of de Gaulle's arrival in Montreal for Expo 67, Cadieux was fishing alone on the lake that bordered his cottage. Suddenly, a bell rang out from the shore. Now, in the Cadieux household, this could mean one of 2 things. Either dinner was ready or there was an emergency. In this case, it was an emergency. When Cadieux docked his boat, his wife gave him the news. De Gaulle had shouted, "Vive le Québec libre," long live free Quebec, from the balcony of Montreal City Hall. As I argue in my book, the ringing of the bell that evening could not have been more symbolic. Since 1964, Cadieux had consistently sounded the alarm in Ottawa about de Gaulle in Quebec and would do so again. That Canada survived this period intact owes much to Cadieux's work behind the scenes, ably assisted by his special advisor and protege, Alan Gottlieb, a proud Winnipegger and one of the DEA's most brilliant legal minds. Cadieux ensured the Pearson government did not bow to Quebec's constitutional demands in the field of external affairs. As for France, Cadieux believed in protesting as long as its provocations towards Canada lasted, since silence implied consent. To Cadieux, those 4 words, "Vive le Québec libre," were a call to arms. Not surprisingly, his private writings on the French intervention bristle with military metaphors. Holding the front, contesting every inch, retreating only as a last resort. As deputy minister, he waged a fierce battle to defend Canadian unity. It was precisely because Cadieux was such a proud French Canadian that he was so disturbed by the narrow Quebec nationalism and separatism that took root in the 1960s. In his view, you didn't need to choose between being a Québécois or a Canadian. You could be both. Cadieur's third great conviction was his professionalism. He strongly endorsed the ideals of the public service, including expertise, political neutrality, and total devotion to the interests of the state. For Cadieux, expertise was a form of patriotism. Nowhere was this truer than in the DEA. The advice its trained professionals gave the government affected nothing less than Canada's unity, security, and prosperity. To Cadieux, there was a mystique about dedicating oneself to the national interest. As he wrote in his books, civil servants should work hard, live modestly, and adhere to a strict moral code. The Foreign Service to him was like a religious order, and the neo-Gothic East Bloc a monastery. Cadieux's image of the Canadian diplomat also had a military dimension. Like soldiers, diplomats served their country wherever they were posted. Family and friends came second to the greater good. As the working class son of a postman, Cadieux was proud of the fact that entry to and promotion within the Foreign Service were governed by merit. Talent, not money or connections, was what mattered. Of course, there will always be political appointments, but he did his best to limit these. When one Canadian general nearing retirement inquired about becoming an ambassador somewhere sunny, like the Caribbean, Cadieux replied, "Mon général, you will get your embassy when I get my own regiment." Cadieux's views on professionalism were shaped by his mentor in the DEA, Norman Robertson. Robertson completely shunned all publicity, believing that it was his anonymity that earned him the government's trust. Since civil servants were unelected, their relationship with politicians was based solely on expertise. Under no circumstance should civil servants cozy up to the party in power. Politicians came and went, but the interests of the state endured. In succeeding Robertson as deputy minister in 1964, Cadieux brought his own strong personality to the job. He was no stereotypical diplomat. He liked to raise his voice and bang his fist on the desk. When angry, Cadieux had a habit of loudly clearing his throat and pulling on his collar as if it were a noose. The sight of him about to explode struck fear into the hearts of junior Foreign Service officers. Yet Cadieux's outbursts were always short-lived and never prevented him from giving the government reliable foreign policy advice. The job of Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs was and is hard work. To blow off steam, Cadieux kept a journal intime, a private diary. Outspoken as he was, even Marcel Cadieux had to observe the proprieties and be a civil servant. In his diary, however, there were no limits. He could vent, uncensored. He dictated it to his secretary. As she told me, when Cadieux was upset, he would fly at her like a bat out of hell. The diary is one of the great primary sources in Canadian diplomatic history. Some of its entries go on for 20 typed pages. Where else could Cadieux get away with calling his opponents in Quebec fanatics, the French pigs, or de Gaulle an evil and rancorous old man? The 1960s were difficult years in Canadian foreign policy. Our UN peacekeepers were ejected from Egypt on the eve of the Six-Day War. Vietnam strained Canadian-American relations, and defense policy came under heavy scrutiny. But the issues that exercised Cadieux most were those that directly challenged his professional ethos. Take, for example, his relationship with his minister, Paul Martin Sr. Martin had many good qualities, but he was also intensely ambitious. There's nothing wrong with a politician being ambitious. Is water wet? Is the Pope Catholic? But Martin's critics felt that his ambition was excessive and compromised his work as foreign minister. According to Cadieux, he was insatiable when it came to publicity and appeared to view the DEA as his personal propaganda machine. He was also constantly demanding foreign policy initiatives from the department. The problem was that by the 60s, Canada's international influence had waned. As Alan Gottlieb told me, nobody gave Martin the initiatives. You had to save him from himself. The most important foreign policy issue in these years was Quebec and France, but Martin seemed oblivious to it. On the eve of de Gaulle's visit to Canada for Expo 67, an alarmed Cadieux said to Martin, "Monsieur Martin, you can continue to close your eyes and plug your ears, but the French are up to no good." Cadieux's view of Martin was harsh, but his frustrations were great. In his diary, he prefaced stories about his minister with the line, "Une autre perle pour la collection," another gem for the collection. Cadieux's relationship with Pierre Trudeau was also challenging. In 1949, after backpacking around the world, Trudeau came to Ottawa interested in joining the DEA. Unimpressed by his scruffy beard and sandals, Cadieux vowed to bar his way. In 1968, however, Trudeau was a media sensation who embodied the youthful spirit of the 60s. The new prime minister saw himself as an agent of change and was prepared to shake up the bureaucracy to get it. His government demanded foreign policy reviews of all kinds, insisting that the DEA consult academics and other vocal critics of Canadian foreign policy. Publicly, Trudeau stated that the diplomatic profession was out of date and that there was nothing he could learn from a diplomatic dispatch that he couldn't get from a good newspaper like the New York Times. Cadieux felt that such behavior undermined morale. Under Trudeau, there was also a major centralization of power in the Prime Minister's office and the Privy Council office, which began really meddling, or at least as Cadieux saw it, in the work of departments. In one notorious case, a secret group went behind the department's back and prepared a memo for cabinet that all but called for Canada's military withdrawal from NATO. Consequently, Cadieux's last 2 years as deputy minister were the unhappiest of his career. He spent them fighting tooth and nail to defend both his department and his profession. There was no love lost between Pierre Trudeau and Marcel Cadieux, but in 1970, the Prime Minister made him Canada's ambassador to the United States, the most prestigious position in the Canadian Foreign Service. Unfortunately, Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger had little interest or time for Canada. As Cadieux joked, Kissinger was like the Holy Spirit. You knew he was there, you just couldn't see him. On one of the few occasions Cadieux did get to see Kissinger, he presented him with a book that Ottawa was distributing to foreign governments to promote salmon conservation. Bored, Kissinger remarked dryly in his guttural German accent, "I hope you aren't going to talk to me about the sex life of the salmon." From Washington, Cadieux went to Brussels, where he served as Canada's ambassador to the European Community, which was, of course, the forerunner of the European Union. The Canadian government was publicly committed to what it called the third option, which was designed to reduce Canada's economic dependence on the United States through increased trade with Europe and Japan, but Cadieux rightly sensed a lack of will in Ottawa to pursue it. Comfortably stationed in Western Europe, he could have coasted into retirement, but that wasn't his style. From Brussels, he tried to prod the government into action in some of the hardest hitting messages that a Canadian ambassador has ever sent to headquarters. These messages didn't exactly endear Cadieux to the government he served, but in 1977, it turned to him once again, this time to represent Canada in high-stakes negotiations with the United States over fisheries and maritime boundaries. It was the final assignment of Cadieux's career, and it demanded all of his skills as a professional diplomat. The ability to see the whole picture, to devise a grand strategy, and to push hard for Canada's goals. He was too successful. After 18 months of painstaking negotiations, Canada and the United States signed a treaty, but the US Senate, believing that the American representative had been completely out-negotiated by Cadieux, refused to ratify it. In 1980, after almost 4 decades of public service, all of which had been spent in the Department of External Affairs, Cadieux retired. Less than a year later, he died of a heart attack. When I look back on Marcel Cadieux's career, I'm struck by the passion and dedication that he brought to his work. Whether it was his anti-communism, his French-Canadian nationalism, or his professionalism. He believed in the ennobling power of worthy causes. As a colleague and friend once remarked of Cadieux, having too many convictions can be a dangerous thing for a diplomat. Throughout his career, however, Cadieux refused to compromise on the principles he cherished. The good fight was too important to be abandoned or to be fought half-heartedly. In the end, he largely succeeded, not in spite of his convictions, but because of them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brendan. That was fascinating. And you know, when I read the book a couple of months ago, I'd forgotten some of those parts. You know, the dealing with Charles de Gaulle and the undermining of the federal arrangements of Canada. Also, Paul Martin Sr., kind of a prima donna minister. So there are a lot of things. You know, Cadieux takes us through from Mackenzie King, Louis Saint Laurent, Diefenbaker, Pearson, and then Trudeau. And so you provide quite a number of insights from behind the scenes, which we tend to see these prime ministers from up front, but we get to see behind the scenes with regard to foreign affairs. So thank you very much. There are some questions that have been posed, and I'm going to go to our friend Gene Waltz, Professor Gene Waltz, and he's been a longstanding member of the book review committee. So I welcome his two questions. And the first one he asks, how did you discover Cadieux? And what made you realize that he could be the subject of a good book?
It's a very interesting question. When I came to the University of Toronto in 2008, I was initially going to write on the National Energy Program. You know, as a Westerner, I was prepared to leave all my biases at the door, or at least try to leave my biases at the door, because we haven't had a book on the NEP since 1985, the only book we have on it. And so that was going to be my project. And I went to the archives and there was almost nothing on the NEP at the National Archives. And so suddenly, in the third year of my PhD, I didn't have a thesis topic. And so I went to my advisor, Robert Bothwell, a historian at the University of Toronto, arguably Canada's foremost political historian. And out of the blue, he said to me, why not write about Marcel Cadieux? And I must confess, I didn't know who Cadieux was when he said that, but he had just written an article about Cadieux and I read it. And I thought, this is an interesting guy. And so the more I read about Cadieux, the more interested I became in him. And then when his family granted me access to his papers at the archives, 40 boxes of them, including the famous diary that only a few historians had seen and nobody had seen it in its entirety until me, that cinched it. And so I became increasingly interested in Cadieux and saw this as not only a biography of Marcel Cadieux, but a chance to really write a book about Canadian diplomacy over a 40-year period. And so I never looked back.
Wow, I can't imagine picking up a dissertation topic like that and running with it. Boy, another question from Professor Gene Waltz is, you mentioned that there is an unpublished manuscript by Cadieux. Have you considered editing it and publishing it?
That's another very good question. It's an interesting one. And so for the audience out there that's not familiar with this, Cadieux, in 1980, of course, this is the year of the first Quebec referendum, and Cadieux felt so passionately about what had happened in the 1960s with de Gaulle and France and Quebec, and Vive le Québec libre in 1967, that in 1980, within weeks of his retirement, Cadieux said to Gilles Léger, former colleague in the department and who had just been Governor General of Canada, of course, he said, I want to write a book on, as he called it, the Gaullist intervention in Canadian affairs. And Cadieux was so determined to do that because the only writing that had really been on it until then had been done by French historians or French commentators. And so both Cadieux and Gilles Léger, who had been our ambassador in Paris in the 1960s and who didn't always get along with Cadieux, he wanted a softer approach to France, felt that this book was essential to kind of change the balance and put forward the Canadian point of view, the federal point of view. And so Cadieux madly wrote this book. Within 3 months, he had a draft of 300 pages. And I didn't find it till shortly, until about 5 years, I think, into my PhD. So 2 years into the Cadieux project. And I discovered that it was his sons who had the book or the draft manuscript. And I had never thought to ask them. I assumed it would be in Cadieux's papers in Ottawa at the archives, and they weren't. And so I had this 350-page book that really gives a lot of insights into the period. But to go to the question that was asked, whether I would consider editing and publishing it, the one problem with the book is that it's curious and that it's more history than memoir. And so at the time it would have been, I would argue, cutting edge. But since then, a lot of water has flowed under the bridge. I think there have been a number of books on Canada and France and Quebec, most recently my own, of course, but many others before me. And so I think in a way, Cadieur's analysis as a historian is somewhat out of date. Every once in a while, there's interesting insight. You know, Cadieux gives his own perspective, but he really treated it as serious history. He put his historian hat on. And so I'm not entirely convinced that the book, if published today, would be much of a success and it would be worth publishing. But it is a project I've considered, so it's an excellent question.
Thank you, Kelly. This question is posed by Dr. Emeka Sastmary. She's the President Emeritus of the University of Manitoba and also a valued member of St. Paul's College. Her question is, thank you so very much. She says, you are as good a speaker as you are an author. I very much enjoyed your fascinating account of Monsieur Cadieux. To me, after reading your book, Cadieux has a moral compass, and I very much like the three directions that he followed in his life. Can you shed some light on his views about the Anglophone environment that met him in Ottawa? He kept a journal. Would it be infelicitous to consider what he wrote in that journal about Anglophone Ottawa?
Yeah, very interesting as well. Cadieux, you know, it was so hard for him when he came to Ottawa in the 1940s because it was such a thoroughly Anglophone environment. There were so few French Canadians, or as what we would say today, Francophones. I don't have the percentages off the top of my head, but I seem to recall seeing 13% of the entire federal public service in 1941 was Francophone. Today, it's closer to about a quarter. And so things have changed so much since official bilingualism. And so what happened with Cadieux is that he grew up in Montreal. Montreal back then, unlike today, was really two solitudes, you know, as Hugh MacLellan writes in his novel. And we have trouble remembering that. But Cadieux and his Francophone friends growing up in Ottawa or Montreal had virtually no interaction with English Canadians. In fact, I don't think Cadieux had a single English Canadian, English-speaking friend in Montreal growing up. He attended the Collège Classique, classical college, run by Catholic religious orders. He went to the Université de Montréal. And so his was a totally French environment. So it was a rude awakening when he came to Ottawa. But what he discovered is that, unlike what some French Canadian nationalists said, you could befriend, even come to like, and who knows, even admire English speakers from the rest of the country. And so all of a sudden, Cadieux was thrown together in the East Bloc with its narrow corridors. He was thrown together with some of the most brilliant English speakers, English-speaking Canadians in the country who had passed the Foreign Service exam. You know, people off the top of my head like Norman Robertson, George Ignatieff, Saul Ray, some of Canada's great diplomats, Hugh Morong, you name it. And far from rejecting them or you know, kind of being uber critical of them in his private writings, Cadieux came to admire them and the Mandarin ethos that they embodied, service to the state. And so I think in many ways, although there were some English Canadians he would meet that he could never take to, who didn't seem interested in French Canadians, who didn't want to have anything to do with him. Those were few and far between. On the whole, his experience in the East Bloc was quite positive in meeting some of these people, and it opened his eyes, and he saw Canada in a fresh way.
Great, and I'm going to ask a supplemental question, and then I'm going to go to one of the other questions that's on the board. Is, you know, fascinating in that book was the early days when he's a Francophone lawyer and his very close friend who's also a Francophone lawyer, and one goes to Ottawa and the other, where does the other one go? Remind me.
Well, which friend are you speaking of? Because Paul Tremblay, his best friend, another
That's
lawyer,
right.
He comes with him. So they both go to Ottawa. But what's interesting there is that Tremblay succeeds on the Foreign Service exam in 1940. Cadieux, and I think there may have been a clerical error or some administrative screw up, at least that's what the archival record suggests, does not. And so he's stranded in Montreal for a year, and he does everything he can to make the cut the next year in 1941, which he does.
Yeah, so I found that a fascinating. clearly I've forgotten some of the facts, but I remember being quite gripped by that early part of your book. So I have a question here from Professor Karen Levasseur, who is in the Political Studies Department at the University of Manitoba and a member of St. John's College. She says, thank you for your presentation. Being from the public administration discipline, there is much that Marcel Cadieux teaches us about the relationship between bureaucrats and the executive. I am curious if you also found that your book speaks to public administration as much as it speaks to international relations and history.
Very interesting. Definitely. Cadieux believed in the dignity of public service. I mean, this is one of the central themes of my book. Not just diplomats, but whether you're working for the Department of Finance or you're working for Trade and Commerce, as it was known back then, Environment Canada. And that was central to Cadieux, this Mandarin ethos that you serve the government. But at the same time, what's really interesting about Cadieux, and I think it speaks to us today, and it goes to the question, is that there's been, and I think many of us would agree, perhaps in the audience, that in a lot of ways there's been an attack on expertise for a number of years going on, whether it's populism on the far right or its equivalent on the far left. And expertise has come under fire, whether it's scientists, doctors as of late, and public servants, diplomats, economists, people who advise government. And Cadieux believed deeply that a public servant obviously has to serve the government in power. That's just how it works. The government in power, the minister is the elected representative. He or she has democratic legitimacy. But that a public servant should not be afraid, to use a popular phrase these days, to speak truth to power. And so in cases where the government was clearly wrong or was going in the wrong direction, a public servant had to do it delicately, but he or she had to tell the government as much, speak to the minister and say, I think this is wrong for these reasons, or this is misguided because of this. And so I think today there's always this danger of, the politicization of the public service or the corruption of the public service. If we look to the United States, I think we've seen some examples of that in the last 4 years, of course. And so I think that Cadieux's career speaks to that, the dignity of public service, total devotion to the interests of the state, and not being afraid to speak up when the ship of state is headed in the wrong direction, not being afraid, not being cowed into simply doing the politician's bidding.
Great, thank you. And here's a question from Kathy Auld. Kathy Auld is just the most recently our chair of the J.W. Dafoe Foundation Board of Directors. And Kathy asks the question, was Gordon Robertson, another Dafoe Book Prize winner, a role model as a civil servant for Marcel Cadieux?
Very interesting as well. And so what's fascinating about Gordon Robertson is that Gordon Robertson joins the Department of External Affairs just 1 year before Cadieux, if I recall, 1940. Now my dates may be a little bit off, but it's right around then. Cadieux joins in 1941. And so Robertson isn't really a role model in the sense that he's a contemporary of Cadieux's. They're almost rivals. And but what's important there is that Cadieux and Gordon Robertson build a good relationship from Gordon Robertson's earliest days in the Department of External Affairs that serves Cadieux well in the 1960s, because Cadieux becomes Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs at the same time that Gordon Robertson becomes clerk of the Privy Council, so the most senior civil servant in Ottawa, the most powerful civil servant in Ottawa. And so Cadieux leverages that connection to get his points across. And so in certain cases where Martin perhaps wasn't doing what he should, to put it mildly, on the France and Quebec file or on other things, Cadieux did not hesitate to use his connection with Gordon Robertson, who of course was at the right hand of the Prime Minister, Lester B. Pearson. And so Cadieux was able to get his advice to the Prime Minister that route. And so no, Cadieux didn't admire Gordon Robertson in the way he admired Norman Robertson, former Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and really his mentor, but they were very close, Cadieux and Gordon Robertson, throughout their careers because they had joined at the same time.
Great. Now, another question from Gene Waltz, and just to let you know, his area of scholarship, which is quite advanced in the area of film studies. Okay. So Gene Waltz asked the question, did Cadieux interact in any way with the National Film Board and its Anglophone and Francophone members who are often near the center of political and social life in Ottawa?
So in terms of the National Film Board, yes, he did. And it's interesting. And this is something that I don't work into my biography of Cadieux because there was only so much space, but Cadieux was on its board of governors. And so there's a little bit in his diary on the National Film Board meetings. And he says that it's rather interesting. He would have attended one, and then he writes in his diary, the National Film Board Board of Directors meeting was stormy as usual. And so there are some interesting insights to the NFB in this period then. So he was involved because Cadieux had a great interest in cultural affairs. He was a very cultured man, literature, film, art, you name it. As a diplomat, he felt that was part of his package, his kind of value added, that he could understand culture, whether it was Canadian or French or English, what have you. And so that was a natural fit because a senior diplomat had traditionally been on the NFB Board of Governors. And so in the early 60s, Cadieux did occupy that position. But where it got somewhat complicated is that sometimes some of the films proposed for approval by the NFB could be quite critical of Canadian foreign policy. And so there was always this tension between, should we approve this? This is taxpayer money. This is the Canadian government we're talking about. Should we approve this film on Vietnam that's extremely critical of the Canadian government's defense sales or facilitation of defense sales to American military contractors? And so that led to often stormy meetings at the NFB.
That's really interesting. I always like to ask an author the question about the cover, because there's always a story about a cover when authors have worked with a character or a theme. And what is the story behind the cover of your book?
Yeah, it's the original photo is a rather simple one. It's simply Cadieux at the wheel of the family car driving, I think it was to North Carolina. So he was ambassador to the United States in the early 70s. And when it came time to choose the photo for the cover of my book, I had a lot of options, but many of them were kind of your stock photos. Cadieux giving a speech, or Cadieux at the United Nations with the Canadian delegation, or Cadieux shaking Richard Nixon's hand in 1970, things like that. But something struck me about this photo. I mean, you have the beret, for example, that he's wearing, and it captures his francophone background. That's right. There's a little, you probably can't tell on the screen, but there's a little fleur de lis, the Quebec fleur de lis near the bottom. And so I think the beret, for example, captures his francophone background. There's also something vigorous and dynamic about him, I think, in that photo. There's something powerful there. There's a force of personality there that I think is interesting. And also, it captures that he's a fascinating man. He's an interesting person. Why does the reader want to pick up this book and read 350 pages about this person? And I think the photo captures just how interesting and in a way almost mysterious he was. The two sides of Cadieux, the civil servant that we always think is almost obsequious and doing the bidding of his political masters or her political masters, but then the other Cadieux, who was so different and almost anti-diplomatic, the banging of his fist on the table and the raising of his voice and the temper. And so I think somehow that photo captured all these things.
Great. Now, I'm just going to ask two more questions, unless there are other questions. Oh, there's a question on the board, but let me squeeze in one question before we go to this question that's sitting there. This was a dissertation originally, and when you read it, it doesn't read like a dissertation. Can you talk a little bit about the work you did as an author, moving from the dissertation over to a scholarly book?
Excellent question. Probably the most important thing about moving from a dissertation to a book is length. My dissertation was too long, I think, like many dissertations. And so it really, when I finished my PhD in 2016, I really had to rethink what material I want to use, what gets set aside, what gets cut. And so that was key. So that I think is the most important thing there, is that length, it's totally different, a dissertation versus a book. Also, a lot of dissertations today are highly specialized, go in for technical language, jargon, and that wasn't a problem, or as I see it, a problem with my dissertation, but I wanted to ensure that this book was as accessible as possible to the lay reader, to the non-specialists. And so far more than in my thesis, which I thought was fairly accessible to begin with, or at least I hope it was, I tried to make the book even more so, to appeal to as broad an audience as possible. Basically any literate Canadian. And I'd like to think and pick up and read and enjoy the book. And so that was important, to really finesse it even more, to make it as readable as possible. The last thing that perhaps is of interest is that the thesis quoted all of Cadieur's French in the original. And so the thesis, everywhere where I quote from Cadieux, it's in French. There was no requirement that I translate it, because fortunately everybody on my thesis committee was bilingual, or at least they claimed to be. In the book, though, UBC Press quickly said that this will limit its audience if you only have the French, because there are many people who can't read French, understandably, and you will be eliminating them as people who can read your book. And so one of the things that took me the longest about this book and getting it into shape was that I had to translate every quotation from Cadieux, hundreds of quotations, from French to English. But what's neat is that if you're a Francophone reader, and I know in Manitoba you have many Manitobans, les Franco-Manitobains, you can find Cadieux's French at the bottom of the page. So Cadieux's French is in a footnote at the bottom of the page. So you have the English, but you have the original Cadieux there. And that took quite some time, and in many ways was the main reason why the thesis ended in 2016. I completed it then, and the book wasn't published until 2019. So getting things into shape on the language front was quite time consuming.
It's a remarkable feature of the book, I have to say, that I did see when I was reading it through the French and the English there. So I applaud you on your effort. Now I'm going to read a question here from Emma Casas-Mary. She says, if I recall correctly, you said in your book that Cadieux was asked in an interview in the early days whether he had read a book called The Diary of a Country Priest. And she says, I've ordered a copy since. Was there anything in Cadieux's diary about this question? Any reflection on the implications of such a question?
Interesting. So that's not quite right, although it's close. Cadieux was never asked a question on Bernanot's Diary of a Country Priest or Journal d'un Curé de Campagne. I think the link there was, if I recall, Norman Robertson, his mentor, couldn't speak French, but he could read French. And Norman Robertson was extremely cultured. And what amazed Cadieux was that Norman Robertson, so the Foreign Service interviews people every year. And so in theory, they take the best of the best. Very few are selected. And one year, Norman Robertson was on the interviewing board, and Cadieux was with him. And one of the applicants who came forward had written a PhD thesis on the great French author Georges Bernanos. And Cadieux was stunned, because he didn't know that Norman Robertson would do this, when Norman Robertson started questioning the applicant, or at least talking to the applicant about Bernanos. And then it quickly became clear, at least to Cadieux, that Norman Robertson, his superior, knew more about Bernanos than the so-called expert on Bernanos who was interviewing to join the Foreign Service. And so I think in this case, it captures Cadieux's admiration for how cultured, at least in his mind, the ideal diplomat is. It's not simply somebody who sits in an embassy and who writes reports that are read back in Ottawa. It's somebody who, reads and has a knowledge of music and literature and film and all these things. And so that was the link, I think, with Bernanos.
Great, thank you. So we're getting close to the top of the hour. I have one more question before we wrap up. And the question is this. Brendan, what are you working on right now? Do you have anything on the horizon, or are you taking a hiatus, or what do you think might be your current or future project?
If all goes well, I'm going to be heading to Ottawa in the new year to head the historical section at Global Affairs Canada within the Canadian government. And so I'm happy to report that a lot of my upcoming projects will continue to deal with Canadian diplomatic history, Canadian foreign policy. The department has an official history, and the third volume has just been published, which ends in 1984. So it really looks at the Trudeau period from 1968 to 1984. So one of my big projects in the future would be writing volume 4 of Global Affairs Canada's history, which would take it from 1984, so Brian Mulroney, to potentially Jean Chrétien in 1993, or even all the way up to Stephen Harper. So I think that project's on the horizon next.
That's fantastic. So I'm going to throw it back over to John over at McNally Robinson. But Brendan, I just want to thank you on behalf of the J.W. Dafoe Foundation Board of Directors and the audience who've been here, and people who will be watching this when the link is put up for future use. But I just want to thank you very much. So I applaud your work, and I look forward to having you sign my book, and hopefully we'll talk in the coming year when I come visit you in Ottawa. Thanks very much again.
Thank you, Dr. Adams. No,
Over to you, John.
Thank you very much to both of you. I'd just like to close by offering some thanks of my own in a moment, but first some information about how you can go about getting a copy of this book. As you can imagine, we have quite a few of them here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Copies are available, although we are sadly closed to the public. You can still order books online or over the phone from us. We will either make them available for curbside pickup. All you have to do is roll up outside and we'll run the book out to the table. Or we're also able to courier books within Winnipeg and also ship them nationally and internationally. So please do keep that in mind if you are looking for a copy. I'd like to continue the gratitude for this evening. First of all, to UBC Press for, of course, publishing this book in the first place. Many thanks to the J.W. Dafoe Foundation for awarding this book and also for helping to put on this evening. I'd like to thank Dr. Christopher Adams for his hosting, Dr. Brendan Kelly for his fascinating presentation, for sharing his depth of knowledge with us and for talking a little bit more about his book. And of course, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us here tonight, either now or in the future as you watch this presentation. Thanks to all of you who are joining us here right now on Zoom for your very thoughtful questions. Those were greatly appreciated. We're going to be closing things down now, but I'd just like to extend a general thanks to all and hope you all have a lovely evening. Hopefully we'll be seeing you again next year. Take care and good night.